The wind rolled low across the dry flats, carrying with it the smell of dust and something older, something dead. The sun hung over the Arizona desert like a watchful eye, and under it, Luke Tanner moved like a shadow, silent and deliberate, his boots kicking up fine trails of sand as he repaired the fence line along the edge of his modest ranch. He worked alone. He always had. His hands, calloused and browned by sun and time, tightened wire around a cedar post with the steady rhythm of a man who knew how to make things last. He didn't hum, didn't curse, didn't think much anymore, just moved from task to task like the wind moved across the plain. Some men talked to their horses, others to God. Luke did neither. The ranch sat on a ridge above a shallow creek bed, with a crooked barn of sun-bleached wood and a cabin small enough to fit inside most saloons. It was all he needed. No family, no neighbors, no hired hands. That suited him fine. Folks in town whispered his name like it came with a blood price. And maybe it did. Once, long ago, Luke Tanner had worn a different face. A scout's hat, a Union badge, a six-shooter on each hip. He'd hunted men then. Killed them, too. Back when the world made sense through a rifle scope. That life had burned itself out in the war. Since then, Luke had made a quiet pact with the land. He wouldn't ask much from it, and it wouldn't ask much from him. But the land had its own way of breaking promises. Late in the evening, when the sky wore its red-orange bruises and the cattle settled into long, low groans of sleep, Luke noticed the sound. Not a coyote. Not the hoot of an owl or the flutter of wings. It was breathing. Ragged. Shallow. Luke rose slowly from his chair on the porch, the boards beneath his boots groaning with age. His Winchester was leaning against the wall. He took it out of habit and stepped down into the dirt, moving toward the well where the windmill creaked its lonely rhythm. There, slumped near the water trough like a pile of bones wrapped in skin, was a child, no older than 10, maybe younger. Apache by the look of him, skin darkened by sun and lineage, hair long and tangled, sticking to a face smeared with dust, his ribs strained against a thin chest. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Luke froze. He knew what this meant. The wrong move, the wrong choice. And this wasn't a child. It was a fuse. The boy looked up, blinking through fevered eyes. His mouth opened, but no words came. His body shook once, then crumpled. Luke stared a moment longer, then lowered his rifle. He knelt beside the boy and pressed his fingers to the neck. A heartbeat, weak, but there. The child's skin burned with fever. No water bottle, no pack. No sign of anyone else nearby. He'd come a long way alone. Luke looked back toward the barn. No one around to see. No one to answer to. Still, he hesitated. A white man helping an Apache child? In these parts? It was a good way to find your barn lit on fire, or a bullet in your back at night. But he couldn't just let the boy die there in the dirt like a dying dog. Damn it all, Luke muttered under his breath. He slipped his arms under the boy's limp frame and lifted him. The child weighed nearly nothing. Bones, heat, and silence. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and horse sweat wrapped around them. Luke laid the boy down in a corner of the hayloft, fetched a canteen, and dribbled water between chapped lips. The boy gagged, coughed, then swallowed. "That's it. Easy now," Luke said, barely above a whisper. He took an old quilt from the tack room and tucked it around the child's frail form. Then he brought what little food he had ready, some jerky, a half loaf of dry cornbread, and placed it nearby. The boy stirred. Luke leaned in, squinting. The child's lips moved. Just one word. "Chaitin," Luke blinked. "That your name?" The boy nodded once, barely. Then he was out cold. Luke sat back on a bale of hay, exhaling through his nose. He stared at the child for a long time. The boy breathed unevenly, like every rise and fall of his chest was a battle. A kid that young should have been with family. A tribe. Not wandering the desert alone. Not on the edge of death. Luke stood and walked outside, grabbing his rifle again. He didn't like this, not one damn bit. He walked the edge of the ranch, checking for tracks, signs, anything. He found a trail of prints, faint but fresh, leading from the southern hills. No other tracks alongside. Whoever left that boy out here didn't come back for him. Or didn't survive. By the time the moon rose above the canyon wall, Luke was sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the barn door, Winchester across his lap. He lit a thin cigar and let the smoke curl into the still air. From inside, the soft rustling of hay. The boy, still breathing. Luke kept his eyes on the open desert. Somewhere out there, someone would be looking for that child. Family, maybe. Or someone worse. And if they came to his door, they wouldn't be knocking. The wind shifted, carrying the distant yip of coyotes. Luke checked the chamber of his rifle, then leaned it against his shoulder. He didn't sleep. That night he thought of the men he'd left in shallow graves, of orders barked across campfires, and screams that never left his dreams. He thought of fire on the horizon, and the smell of scalp and blood. He thought of the time he watched a boy barely older than Chayton take a bullet in the back because someone thought he moved suspiciously. He thought of all the times he'd chosen to look away. Not tonight. Tonight he'd chosen to act. The moon drifted across the sky, dragging its silver light across the barn and casting long shadows like ghosts. Luke Tanner sat silent, eyes open, rifle ready, watching the dark. The desert didn't sleep. Even when the stars soaked the sky like spilled powder, the land whispered, soft breezes over sand, the creak of wood, the occasional shriek of a hunting owl. Luke Tanner sat in the half-shadow just outside his barn, the glow of the dying lantern behind him barely touching the dust at his boots. The rifle lay across his knees, one hand resting on the worn walnut stock, the other curled tight near the trigger guard. Inside, the boy hadn't moved much. His breathing rasped from time to time, shallow and uneven, like someone drowning slow in air. Luke could hear it even now, layered beneath the sounds of the night. He hadn't let himself sleep. He didn't plan to. Something about this didn't sit right. Not just the boy's condition or how he came to be there, but what might be coming next. Nothing this strange happened without something following behind it. Luke knew that too well. The Apache weren't known for leaving their own behind. And if they were looking for the boy, if they found him here, he shifted slightly, adjusting his weight as the wind picked up and brushed along the boards of the barn like a warning. Old wood groaned in the night. Luke scanned the ridgelines beyond his property, where distant silhouettes of cactus stood like soldiers at attention. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling hadn't left him. That old gut-deep sense, the one he'd carried through war and ambushes and blood-drenched plains. Something was watching. Or maybe remembering. His mind drifted, uninvited, to another night, years back. Different camp, different sky, same rifle in his lap. Only that time the wind had carried smoke. They'd come up on an Apache village that morning. Orders were to pacify the area. Luke had ridden in behind the others. Late, always late, and by the time he got there the pacifying had already begun. Smoke, screams. And a boy, small, no more than 6, raced from a burning tent, hair streaked with ash, barefoot, his face smeared with soot and fear. One of the boys from Luke's company leveled his pistol, casual as lighting a cigar. Luke had seen it happen, seen the boy fold in on himself and crumple into the dust like cloth torn from a line. He'd stared a long time before he got off his horse, never said a word. He rubbed his hand down his face now, scraping away the memory like mud that wouldn't come off. Inside the barn, Chayton shifted. A dry cough rattled through the boards. Luke turned, pushed himself up slowly, and walked back into the heavy warmth of the space. The boy was awake. His eyes, though half-lidded and sunken, tracked Luke as he approached. Fear lingered in the corners of them, but not panic. Not wild, just tired, like he'd been afraid for too long and didn't have the strength for it anymore. "You still with me?" Luke asked softly, squatting beside him. The boy didn't answer. His lips were cracked, dry, blood flaking from the corners. Luke fetched the canteen again and poured a little water into the tin cup, lifting it gently to his mouth. Chayton sipped, slow, careful. After a moment he whispered something in Apache. Luke didn't know the words, but the sound was soft, almost like thanks or maybe prayer. "I don't speak it, kid," Luke said, settling back. The boy blinked once. "You hungry?" No reply. Luke pulled out a strip of jerky and broke off a piece, holding it out. Chayton took it with trembling fingers, sniffed it, then tucked it under the blanket. He didn't eat it. Smart, Luke thought. Too sick to keep it down, saving it for later. He stood again and leaned against a beam, arms folded. "You got folks looking for you." The boy didn't move. Luke studied him in silence. He was dressed in a tattered shirt that had once been white. His pants were torn and soaked in places with old blood. Not his, Luke guessed. Not all of it. His moccasins were worn through at the toes. He hadn't been lost by accident. Luke felt the back of his neck tingle again. A bad kind of silence had taken root in the barn. Not the calm kind. The kind before something breaks. That gut feeling returned, low and deep. He stepped outside again, this time circling the entire barn with slow, deliberate steps. The desert stretched quiet and still. No footprints beyond his own. No sign of tracks on the dirt road leading south. Nothing. He didn't believe it. He went back inside and pulled a blanket from his own cot in the cabin. Rolled it up and set it beside the boy. "Rest," he said, then returned to his watchpost just outside the barn doors. He didn't rest himself. When the first gray hues of dawn began to melt into the sky, Luke stood, stiff and dusty, joints creaking with the cold that comes just before sunrise. The wind had stopped. The land felt too still. He walked over to the edge of the property, eyes sweeping the horizon. To the east, ridge lines painted in faint lavender. To the south, hills that stretched out toward the desert, still nothing. But then, in the stillness, he saw it, one rock, maybe 200 yards off, with a fresh mark carved through the dust beside it, too straight for an animal. A toe drag. Someone had knelt there. Luke's heart thudded once. He turned, walked back into the barn, and found Chayton sitting up slightly, his small hands clutching the jerky piece he'd hidden. "You got family, don't you?" Luke asked quietly. Chayton looked at him but didn't reply. Luke crouched beside him. "Are they close?" This time, a faint nod. "Barely." Luke's voice hardened a little. "You running from someone or trying to get back?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, Chayton raised his hand and touched the center of his chest with 2 fingers. Slowly, he moved them out in front of him, palm open. A sign. Maybe Apache. Maybe something else. Luke stared at him. The boy's face was still too pale, but his eyes had cleared slightly. Less fear, more focus. "I don't understand," Luke muttered. The boy whispered again. "Chayton, I remember." Luke stood up. "You're safe here, for now." Chayton turned his face to the side and closed his eyes. But Luke didn't feel safe. Not yet. He spent the rest of the morning making sure the horses were watered, and the rifle was cleaned. He kept one eye on the ridge. The tracks he'd seen had vanished in the rising heat. The wind, though gentle, was enough to wipe away signs. Whoever had been near his land had left quietly, or was still here. That evening, Luke decided to head into the canyon trail behind the property. It wasn't more than a narrow draw with brush and stone, but it gave him a view south without exposing himself on the open plain. He climbed slow, careful, watching for signs. He found one, a broken arrow wedged under a crevice in the rock, fresh, feathered in bright red. Luke picked it up and turned it in his hand. The tip was obsidian. Sharp, beautiful. Not a weapon of war, but one of significance. A message. He stayed there until the sun dipped low again, watching for movement. There was none. Back at the ranch, Chayton was asleep again, curled tighter into the blanket, color slowly returning to his cheeks. Luke placed a few stones in a loose pile near the barn door. An old scout trick. If someone stepped past them in the night, he'd hear. He went back to his place under the stars, rifle at his side. The desert wind came back after dark, whispering in a language older than blood. Luke listened. He didn't sleep, not while something unseen circled just beyond the edge of firelight. The sun rose hard over the Arizona hills, not with warmth, but with weight, a bright, searing burden that peeled away the mist and exposed everything for what it was. Luke Tanner stood just beyond his corral, one hand shielding his eyes as he studied the southern horizon. The ridgeline in the distance wavered with heat, but something was different now. Something subtle. It wasn't the light. It was the stillness. Not a single bird cry. Not the clatter of a breeze against the tin roof. Even the cattle were hushed, standing oddly still in their pen, as if they too had sensed the wrongness in the air. Luke's boots scraped over the dirt as he stepped toward the barn, every movement deliberate, eyes flicking side to side. The quiet had teeth now, a silence that pressed against his skin like a warning. Inside the barn, Chayton was sitting up again, his back braced against the wall of hay. His skin had lost some of its gray pallor, his lips no longer cracked, still gaunt, still fragile, but alive, alert. "You slept," Luke said as he approached, keeping his voice low. Chayton nodded once. His eyes were sharp this morning, different from the sunken look of days past. He held the empty tin cup in his lap like it meant something. Luke crouched next to him. "You remember anything else? Where you came from?" Chayton didn't answer, but he turned his head, slowly, toward the east. Luke followed his gaze. "Someone coming?" The boy didn't blink. Luke rose, crossed the barn floor, and stepped outside. There it was. At first, just dust, fine and far off, barely more than a shimmer above the horizon. But it was growing, a lot of it, rising in a long line, wide and straight, not scattered like wild horses or a cattle stampede. No, this was organized. Luke's breath left him slow. He walked to the shed, opened the door, and pulled out a long case. From it, he took his Sharps rifle, an old buffalo gun, blackened steel, iron sights still true. He checked the bore, then the cartridges, clean, loaded. Then he looked again toward the dust. It was closer now. The shapes were beginning to form. Horsemen. Dozens. No, hundreds. Luke didn't move for a moment. His heart beat slow, measured, each thud heavy against his ribs. He turned back to the barn, ducked inside, and crossed to where Chayton still sat. "You got family, all right," Luke muttered, "and they've come for you." Chayton stared up at him, unblinking. Luke pointed with the rifle toward the open door. "Is that your tribe?" A beat passed, then another. And then the boy nodded. Just once. Luke felt the weight settle in his chest. 500 Apache warriors, maybe more. And they were headed straight for him. He didn't ask questions. He moved. He brought Chayton out of the barn and into the house, helped him lie down on the cot, and handed him the rest of the water. Then he barricaded the windows, bolted the door, and returned to the front step with both rifles, one for range, one for speed. They came slow at first. No war cries. No raised weapons, just a wall of riders on the edge of the world, kicking up the desert like a coming storm. Luke stood his ground. The distance between them closed. He could see them now, painted faces, braided hair, long rifles slung over shoulders, silent, dignified, like ghosts rising out of the past. The line of them stopped maybe 100 yards from the barn. Then it parted. A single rider came forward, flanked by two others. Luke stepped down from the porch and walked halfway across the yard, rifle slung over his shoulder but ready. He kept his hands away from the trigger. The rider in the center dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and older than most of the others, face carved by time, eyes dark and watchful. He wore a robe of dyed leather and a necklace of bone and turquoise that caught the morning light like fire. He spoke a word in Apache. The two at his side stepped back. The man took one more step forward, then stopped. Luke stood still, watching. From behind the wall of riders, another figure appeared. It was Chayton, not as he'd last seen him, sickly and weak, but standing tall, still thin, but fierce in his own small way. His face was painted now, his chest wrapped in fresh linen. Someone had brought him out through the back without Luke noticing. He must have walked from the house while Luke's eyes were fixed on the riders. Chayton moved toward the older warrior, who knelt and pulled him into an embrace. They stayed like that for a long time. Luke didn't move. Finally, the older man stood and turned back to Luke. The two younger men returned to his side. One of them stepped forward. "He is Chief Nantan," the man said in clear, accented English, "leader of the White Mountain Apache. The boy you sheltered is his blood." Luke let the rifle slip from his shoulder and held it loosely in his hand. "I didn't know who he was," he said. "Didn't matter." The translator relayed the words. Nantan nodded once, then spoke. "He says you gave life to what others would have let die," the translator said. "For this, we came not to take, but to honor." Luke blinked. "You brought an army for that?" "No army," the man replied. "Witnesses." And then, in one silent, synchronized movement, the entire line of warriors dismounted. 500 men, boots in dust. No sound, except the breath of horses and the shifting of leather. Nantan stepped forward again, this time holding something in his hand. A spear. It was long, carved with symbols, feathers hanging from its base. He walked to the center of Luke's yard and thrust the spear into the earth. "This is sacred ground now," the translator said. "This is where a warrior chose peace." Luke stared at the spear, then at the boy standing beside the chief. Chayton's eyes locked with his for a moment, and in them was something ancient, something heavy. Respect. The boy raised his hand, palm forward, fingers extended, and held it steady. Luke didn't know the meaning, but he raised his own hand the same way. The moment hung there. Then the line of warriors moved again, each one stepping forward one by one toward the spear. As they passed, they nodded or bowed. Some touched the earth. Some left small tokens, stones, feathers, beads. Luke didn't say a word. By midday, the yard was quiet again. The Apache had gone, fading back into the land like they'd never been there. Only the spear remained, standing proud in the soil, wrapped in shadow and light. Luke sat on the porch that evening, the old rifle across his lap once more, but it felt heavier now. Not with threat, with meaning. Chayton had not returned. He'd left with the warriors. But Luke knew that wasn't the end of it. The boy would be back, not because he owed anything, but because something had passed between them, unspoken, yet stronger than blood. The wind picked up again, warm and dry, tugging at the old bones of the ranch. It carried with it the scent of sage and sweat, of leather and fire, of change. Luke sat still, watching the horizon. He didn't sleep. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The days after the Apache vanished were quiet, but it was not peace. The kind of quiet that settled over Luke Tanner's ranch was the kind that waited, watched. It crept into corners, lingered beneath the eaves, coiled behind every breath, like something ready to strike. Even the cattle, as dumb and slow as they were, sensed it. They moved with caution, eyes wide, tails twitching without flies. Luke spent his days in silence. He patched the barn roof, where rain had begun to sneak through in the early mornings. He stacked wood, repaired fence posts, and hunted jackrabbit. Work had always been a kind of medicine for him. Not healing. No, nothing healed in men like Luke, but something close, something dulling. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on Chayton's face before he rode off. Something quiet and powerful, the kind of look you only see once in a man and never forget. It hadn't been a goodbye. Luke knew what goodbye looked like. That boy had looked at him the way a warrior looks at another across a fire. Mutual, unspoken, bound by things that don't need naming. The spear still stood where Chief Nantan had driven it, planted deep in the earth just beyond the porch, Luke hadn't touched it. He hadn't dared. Around it now, without his doing, a small circle had formed. Not of stones, not of markings, just space. Animals didn't walk near it. The wind didn't kick dust around it. It was as if the desert itself had acknowledged the weight of that gesture. People in town heard the story, of course. News traveled fast in places where men had too much time and too little sense. By the third morning, a pair of riders showed up from Dry River, a skinny cattleman named Floyd Harker and his thick-necked brother Gil. They didn't dismount, just sat on their horses at the edge of the property, watching the ranch like it had grown horns overnight. Luke walked out to meet them, rifle slung low, calm in his step. "Morning," Floyd called, lifting his hat but not his eyes. "You've heard then," Luke said. "Hard not to," Gil answered. "Whole damn desert lit up with the tale. You really get 500 Apache lining up in your yard?" Luke didn't answer. Floyd looked past him, squinting. "That spear, that the one?" Luke nodded. Gil leaned forward in the saddle. "What's it mean?" Luke shrugged. "Means I fed a boy." Floyd spit in the dust. "Sounds like it means you picked a side." Luke's eyes hardened. "You come here to accuse me of something?" "No," Floyd said, but he didn't sound sure. "Just curious what kind of man draws a line that even Apache won't cross." Gil nudged his horse a step forward. "What kind of deal you make, Luke? You give him something? Offer up your land in trade for your scalp?" Luke stared at him, still as stone. Floyd put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "That's enough." The two of them turned their horses, and with a parting nod, rode off the way they came. Luke didn't watch them go. He stood there in the morning light, jaw tight, until their shapes disappeared over the hills. That night, someone fired a shot near the cattle fence. He heard it just past midnight, sharp, sudden, too close. The cattle stirred, bellowing in fear, knocking over feed bins. Luke was already moving, rifle in hand, boots on the porch before the second echo died. He crouched near the well, eyes scanning the dark, listening. No more shots came. At sunrise, he found a carcass on the northern edge of the pasture. One of his steers, chest ripped open, tongue cut. No scavengers had touched it. Not even ants. Message sent, message received. But Luke didn't go to town. He didn't ride out with accusations. He didn't hang a sign or tell a soul. Instead, he buried the steer in a shallow grave by the creek. Then he cleaned his rifle, replaced the lantern oil, and put out extra grain for the horses. And then he waited. On the fifth day, Chayton returned. He didn't come in a group, didn't ride with ceremony. He came walking alone through the canyon at dusk, his frame framed by firelight in the sky. His feet moved with the precision of a boy who belonged to the land, not just walked on it. Luke saw him first from the edge of the porch. He didn't rise, didn't wave. Just waited until the boy got close enough to see the familiar glint in Luke's eyes. Chayton said nothing. Luke offered a nod. "You're back." The boy looked older somehow. A fresh scar marked the curve of his jaw. He carried a small bundle wrapped in hide. He walked straight to the barn and sat by the hay where he'd first lain sick. Luke followed and leaned on the post nearby. "You all right?" Chayton unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a carved wooden figure. An eagle in flight. Intricate. Wings swept back. It had weight. Age. He held it out. "For me?" Luke asked. Chayton nodded. Luke took it carefully, turning it over in his hand. The grain was smooth, the edges worn from time. "What does it mean?" Chayton drew a circle in the dust, then placed a rock in the center. Luke looked from the carving to the dirt. "A guardian?" The boy's eyes met his, steady, certain. Luke sat down in the hay beside him, silent, for a long time. Finally, he said, "They think I made a deal, the men in town. They think I traded something for peace." Chayton tilted his head slightly. "I didn't," Luke muttered. "Didn't ask for peace. Didn't think it'd ever come." The boy took a breath. Then, slowly, he pointed to the spear outside. Luke nodded. That part one, understand. That night, they sat near the fire pit outside the barn. Luke cooked beans in the cast iron, and Chayton added some herbs he'd brought in a pouch at his hip. The taste was rich, unfamiliar, but warm. After they ate, Luke asked, "You come back to stay?" Chayton didn't answer. But he didn't leave either. They stayed up late, the fire crackling, the desert sky alive with stars. Luke told a story, short, ragged, about a horse he'd once had that kicked harder than a mule and ran faster than a train. The boy listened, no smile, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. By the time the fire died, Luke had given the boy his old blanket, rolled out the spare bedroll, and left the door unlatched. In the morning, Chayton was gone, but the eagle carving sat on the table inside the cabin, perfectly centered, as if it had always belonged there. The weeks that followed carried change on the wind, not big things, just shifts, ripples. A group of riders from town came again, this time led by Mayor Harlan, an old man with bad teeth and worse politics. He brought a bottle of rye and 2 tin cups. Luke poured but didn't drink. Harlan leaned on the porch rail, looking out at the spear. "So it's true," he said finally. "They left you a mark." Luke nodded. "Strange thing," Harlan muttered. "Nobody's raided cattle near Dry River in 3 weeks. Used to lose 2, 3 a month. Now nothing. You think that's connected?" Luke didn't answer. Harlan sipped, grimaced, then said, "Some of the boys want me to tell you to take it down. The spear. Says it makes you look like one of them." Luke looked at him. "Just looked." Harlan nodded. "Didn't say I agreed. Hell, I've seen worse peace treaties." Then he drained the rest of his cup and rode out without another word. By the first snow, Luke saw Chayton 3 more times. Each visit was quiet. The boy never stayed more than a night. Always brought something. A bird's feather, a pouch of crushed root, once even a rabbit already skinned. Luke never asked what the gifts meant. He accepted them, placed them in a row beneath the eagle carving. A shrine of sorts, a language made of silence. He also noticed something else. The men in town still watched him, but they stopped whispering when he walked into the saloon. The storekeeper no longer asked why he needed so much salt. A group of boys who used to throw rocks at his fence now rode past without glancing over, and the circle around the spear grew larger. Animals still avoided it. Rain never muddied it. And Luke never stepped inside it without removing his hat. He'd chosen silence long ago. A kind of penance. A life stripped down to the essentials, where the past stayed buried and the future wasn't his to hope for. But now, each time the wind shifted, he heard something different in it. Not words, but welcome. Not forgiveness, but understanding. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was enough. And it had started with a starving child, a bowl of water, and a choice made in the dark. Luke Tanner had not become a legend. He had not become a hero. But on a patch of land where vultures once circled and blood once soaked into dust, he had become something far more dangerous. A man who proved compassion could be stronger than fear. And the desert, in its own ancient way, remembered. The years came slow on the frontier. Not like the rush of days in a town where people talked too much and listened too little. Out here, a man counted time by the wind and the way the sky changed, by the feel of the earth under his boots, the weight of seasons shifting in the bones. Luke Tanner aged like the desert, quietly and without apology. By the time the 3rd winter rolled across the dry hills, the barn was older, patched more times than Luke could remember, and the roof sagged slightly on the east side. But it held. The cabin, too, leaned more with every gust of storm wind, but Luke had stopped fighting it. Some things weren't meant to stay perfect. The spear still stood, untouched, unbothered, now weathered gray by sun and wind, feathers long since taken by time, but the carved markings were still sharp, still deep. Men who came by didn't talk about it anymore. They rode past with heads down or stopped to stare, but none dared ask why it still stood. No one ever asked about Chayton either, because Chayton had become more story than boy. People said he was the spirit of the White Mountains, that he vanished into the clouds and walked the canyon walls at dusk. Others claimed he lived among the jaguars to the south, or had become a war chief even before manhood. Some said he died in a raid, others whispered he led it. Luke heard it all, nodded, never corrected anyone. But the truth was simpler. Chayton came back, not always with fanfare, not as often as before, but he came. Luke would find him sometimes, sitting by the fire before dawn, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the glowing coals like he'd never left. Other times he came on horseback, not alone, but with another boy or girl riding behind him, tribe children, quiet, curious, watchful. They never stayed long. They didn't have to. They came to listen. Luke didn't tell stories like a drunk at the saloon, but when the fire cracked just right and the night wrapped itself around the ranch, he'd speak. Just enough. He'd tell them how once, a long time ago, there was a man who could shoot the wings off a crow at 50 yards and didn't lose sleep over it. A man who followed orders without blinking and slept beside death like it was an old friend. And then he'd tell them about the boy. Not by name, just the boy. The one he found near dead beside a watering trough, ribs like fence rails, eyes like thunderclouds. And how that boy didn't beg or plead. He just existed, quiet and proud. And how that changed something in the man forever. Sometimes Luke would wake in the night to soft footsteps on the porch, a shadow near the barn. Sometimes nothing would be there in the morning but a new carving placed near the spear or a bundle of sage tied with deer sinew left on the steps. The ranch had become a crossing place, not a sanctuary. Luke didn't believe in that word. Too clean, too church-like, but a space where things pass through. Spirits, stories. People running from things, looking for things, trying to remember or trying to forget. He didn't turn any of them away. One cold autumn, a young soldier showed up. Barely 20, wearing a torn blue coat and hollow eyes. Said he'd deserted down near Tucson and had been walking 3 days. Asked Luke for water. Luke gave him water, then food, then a bed in the barn. The soldier never asked why the spear stood where it did, but the next morning, before he left, he placed a worn medal at the base of it and didn't say a word. Luke buried the medal beneath a small flat stone, said nothing either. Later that winter, a settler family passed through, man, wife, 2 kids, traveling east to escape the sickness that had swept through Yuma. The man offered money for supplies. Luke gave him what he had. The woman, eyes too wide for her age, watched the spear like it might come alive. Luke gave her a piece of jerky for the boy, nodded once, and watched them ride out into the wind. One night, maybe 5 years after that first morning of dust and hooves, Luke was sitting beside the fire again, the rifle leaned against his chair more from habit than fear. His back hurt more now, his fingers ached in the cold, but he was still breathing, and the fire still warmed his boots. That night, Chayton came again. But he wasn't alone. He came with Chief Nantan, older now, hair fully silver, shoulders still strong, but time etched deep into every line of his face. They rode, side by side, no words spoken between them, just presence. Luke stood when he saw them, removed his hat. Nantan dismounted, looked at the spear, then at Luke. He stepped forward and did something he had never done before. He held out his hand. Luke took it, rough palm to rough palm, and the desert felt quieter for a moment. They didn't speak long, just a few words. They shared food, sat by the fire. Nantan told a story, through Chayton's translation, about the time before the white men came, about a trail that crossed the northern hills, used by deer and spirit walkers. About a place where warriors would leave their weapons to speak without blood between them. Your land, he said, has become such a place. Luke listened. Nantan stood after a time, walked to the spear, and placed a new feather on the shaft, bright red, bound with black sinew. Then he and Chayton rode off again, their horses swallowed by the night. Luke sat there a long time after. The wind came up from the canyon carrying the smell of wood smoke and cedar. He closed his eyes, felt it on his skin like a whisper. The desert was still watching, but it no longer watched him as a stranger. When spring came, so did the rains. Not heavy, just enough to soak the topsoil, to breathe life into the cacti and the pale green things that clung to the edges of the rocks. Luke watched the ground shift, open, and drink. He planted nothing, but things grew, small shoots near the fence, wild herbs near the barn, a patch of sunflowers bright as gold near the spear. He didn't understand it, but he didn't question it. The past was still there. He felt it in his knees every time he walked, in his chest, every time the wind blew south. He carried the faces of men he'd killed, the sounds of horses screaming during battles, the endless silence that followed every shot. But for all that weight, something else had taken root too, the memory of a boy. Thin, starved, proud, eyes that carried storms, a whisper of a name, Chaitan. It meant falcon. Luke found that out only years later, from a traveler who passed through, speaking Apache from his mother's side. When Luke asked the meaning, the man had smiled. Sky hunter, he'd said, fast, fierce, free. Luke liked that. He didn't tell anyone what the boy had done, didn't say how close death had come. He didn't have to, because the desert told its own story, and long after Luke Tanner was gone, buried beneath the same land he'd worked with those quiet, careful hands, the story remained. Not carved into stone, but in the hush of the wind, the path of riders who stopped and turned back, the small offerings placed gently around a weathered old spear that no one had ever dared remove. And somewhere in the high canyons, if you listened close enough, you could still hear hooves in the dust, a voice like thunder wrapped in boy's skin, and the echo of a morning when 500 warriors chose to honor a man, not for his power, but for his mercy. Luke Tanner had chosen silence, and in doing so, he gave others the chance to speak. In a land forged by fire, dust, and blood, one man's quiet choice rewrote the fate of a child and changed the way enemies looked at each other forever. Luke Tanner didn't seek glory, nor forgiveness, but in feeding a starving boy, he sowed a seed of peace in a place that had only known war. And that, in the end, made him part of a legend far greater than himself. If this tale stirred your heart and left the dust of the frontier in your soul, don't ride off just yet. Subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles for more unforgettable stories of courage, compassion, and the unexpected bonds that bloom in the hardest of times. Saddle up. There's a whole trail of stories ahead, and you won't want to miss the next ride.